welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. It is Saturday evening, the 23rd of March 2019, and it is Saturday Night Silver with Smaulgld. Welcome, Smaulgld Mug Stackers and Game Changers. Tonight's topic is a flood of silver heads to China. And tonight's episode is the latest installment in the Smaulgld History of Silver series. And you can check out all prior episodes at the playlist at the YouTube channel under Playlists. Just look for Smaulgld History of Silver. Tonight we're going to be talking about the birth of global trade and a global currency. And maybe you can guess what that currency might have been. Now, we know about the Silk Road, and the Silk Road was somewhat of a attempt at global trade, but it really only included Europe and Asia. And that goes all the way back to Marco Polo and trying to get the silk and the other goods from China, the spices from the east, the Spice Islands, Indonesia, India. Those are all places that Europe was interested in, is getting over there and getting the spices. And it was very expensive. There was a lot of overland travel. And it really wasn't until a big event happened in the late 15th century. And that was the expulsion of the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. And that's Spain and Portugal today. With that gone, Portuguese and Spanish, who were on the far end of Europe, and really not at the center of trade in any way, shape, or form, certainly not with China or India, they were the ones who started this creation of a global economy. And the Spanish were the first to start heading west via the Atlantic Ocean, and everyone knows about Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue and ending up somewhere in the Caribbean and, that founding America and so on. But that trip, while it was, I suppose, innovative and one of the first of its kind, it was the first of its kind, unless you want to go back to Leif Erikson landing up in Greenland or Newfoundland. But it didn't really open up much at the time because those areas were in the Caribbean, and eventually the Caribbean would be developed as part of the Spanish Main, but that was not the area. It wasn't the United States, clearly, that was leading the New World. In fact, all of the activity that happened in the New World early on was all south of where Columbus landed, all in the Central American, the Mexican area, Central America, and all the way down to Bolivia and Peru. We're going to see all that developed. What the Portuguese were focused on mostly, although they were over in the Atlantic as well, while the Spanish headed west across the Atlantic, the Portuguese headed south and around the tip of Africa. So you had Bartholomew Diaz took his first trip, I think, around 1488. He went down around the Cape of Good Hope, which is somewhat at the tip of Africa, and that paved the way for Vasco da Gama about 11 years later to actually make the trip around and get over to India. And that opened up a very big trade route for the Portuguese. And they immediately started setting up trading posts and forts all along the coast of India. And then another thing that happened, about 30, 40 years later, was once the Spanish and Portuguese had made it over across the Atlantic from Spain and Portugal, was that didn't really help them trade with Asia. That was the whole point in getting to Asia going across the Atlantic. They thought they were going to be able to trade with India and China a lot easier. Well, Portuguese figured out a good way to get there was go around the south of Africa and head over to Asia. But once they realized where they were, which was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and nowhere near Asia, actually heading in the opposite direction, they started to explore. And they realized that as things went on, that there was a Pacific Ocean right on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean when you went down across land, across Mexico to its west coast. If you went down towards Panama, it was a very short crossing there. When they got into Bolivia and Peru on the west coast there, they realized they were facing the Pacific Ocean. And they had to figure out a way to go from there across to China, and eventually they set up a trading post in Manila. So you had the Portuguese and the Spanish traversing the Atlantic Ocean, going down the Atlantic Ocean around the Cape of Africa, Cape of Good Hope, into the Indian Ocean, and then eventually going back and forth across the Pacific from Asia over to Mexico. Now, they were doing this, of course, looking for spices. And the idea was that if you can get rich selling spices, what everyone wanted to do back then, if you were a landed person and there wasn't enough, you didn't have enough money to buy land, you would become a merchant or some type of conquistador or some type of trader, and you would buy and sell spices, and then you could buy land with your proceeds and then live off of the laborers. And spices were extremely expensive. They were worth more money than gold and silver. Now, gold and silver are also good to trade with because they were durable and easy to transport, but peppercorns and cinnamon and cloves and spices were even lighter and even more expensive. So back at the time, in the 1500s, to buy a pound of peppercorns cost you 18 pounds of sterling silver. So today that's about $5,000, about $4,400. Cinnamon cost you 24 pounds of sterling silver, cloves 26 pounds. So it's a very lucrative thing to get yourself some spices. So that's why all these expeditions were trying to figure out ways to make it the most cost-effective way to get to Asia, to pick up the spices and bring them back. Now, of course, over land, it takes time, and you also run into getting robbed along the way. But then, of course, you had piracy eventually once they set up trading routes that also tried this, and you had shipwrecks and so on. So very risky but a high reward trade was to get somehow to the Spice Islands, to get into Manila in the Philippines, get to China somehow, and bring back your spices. And the Portuguese set up a lot of trading routes and trading posts, as I mentioned, India, I think in near Goa, Bombay, all along the west coast of India. And they would trade, stop off in Africa, pick up some gold, and then they would use that in many instances as payment. But we're not going to focus on gold. We're going to focus on silver. Now, when the Spanish got to the Americas, that really didn't help them. They weren't going to get any spices there. But they were very lucky, and they found enormous wealth in the mines, silver and gold. And this is when you had the rise of the conquistadores. You had Hernan Cortez in Mexico, the other guy, Pizarro, I think he was in Peru. Yeah. And they found silver, especially in Mexico and in Bolivia. And under the arrangements that they had with the crown, if they could control the area, they were entitled under this system called encomiendas, where it was somewhat of a land trust, and it essentially instituted a form of slavery where the Spanish crown would give them dominion over the natives, and then they would be allowed to work for them, and they had to teach them Christianity. And what the conquistadores did was they controlled them and used them to mine the silver. And then they made those silver finds and they appropriated them for the benefit of Spain. I think there was a kind of a tribute you had to pay, La Quinta, you had to pay 1/5. And a lot of what you mined, and 1/5 of that went back to Spain, and it flooded the Spanish market, causing hyperinflation, because in a sense that is an increase in the money supply when you send all that silver back. So now all of a sudden silver is massively plentiful. You're not just relying on the Polish or the European mines that they had for silver, but you've got this big influx of silver coming from the New World, from all on the Americas in the Spanish Main. Now, the good thing is that they have this silver. There's somebody who wants it. So watch what happens here. Cortez and They find massive silver finds in 1546 in Mexico, north and west of Mexico City. And then in 1545, they find the biggest silver mine ever in Potosi. And there, it's just an enormous amount of silver. It's in this mountain, and it's almost mythical. It's 13,000. It's 13,000 feet high. This mountain. There's silver at the base. There's silver near the mountain, in the mountain. There's a picture of it right there. That is in modern day Bolivia. And this city became so rich. Man, this is 1545. So you talk about the United States, it's not even a thought yet. No one's living in, I think you've got colonies coming in 1603 to Jamestown or Virginia, things like that. 1620 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Very small colonies. That's because they were English. The Spanish were the first to the Americas in a big way. They got a head start. They're there in 1492 on. Portuguese are there 1500, 1510. By 1535, they find this massive silver and they start to exploit it. And it produced, by the second half of the 16th century, 60% of the silver coming from the New World. And this city got to 200,000 people in the 1550s, 1560s, which means it was a major world city at the time. Remember, cities weren't that big. 200,000 was a substantial. There was nothing like it in the New World at the time. There was no New York at the time. Hadn't even existed yet. There was nothing in there was no Chicago, Los Angeles. This was a huge city. And today, the city is about still 174,000 people. But obviously, back then, it was a mega city at the time. And they have an expression in Spanish, vale un Potosi, which means extraordinary. It's worth a lot. Extraordinary riches. It's mentioned in Miguel de Cervantes' novel Don Quixote as this mythical place of extraordinary riches. And there was all these types of finds. This was the biggest one, but there were finds all throughout the New World. And they were sending the silver back to Spain, and as I mentioned, that caused inflation. The other thing that's pretty extraordinary, at the time, they started to make mints in the New World, and Mexico City and all these places in the New World, or New Spain, very, very rich, very cosmopolitan, and that's in 1535. Mexico opened up, well, it wasn't called Mexico, it was New Spain, it was under the crown of Spain, opened La Casa de Moneda de Mexico, which is still functioning as a mint, and it was designed to make the coins that were from the locally mined silver. It was founded in 1535 after Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire, and by 1598 they started to make the substantial quality silver coin, not just stuff to get it into a form to ship back to to Spain, but in a form that could be used in international currency. And you're going to see how that international trade and they developed and why they needed this international currency. So here is a later example. Now these coins were minted. These in a sense were the first global currency. They started making them around 1600, and they were into use for about 250 years as an international medium of exchange in trade. This one is from 1821, and it's called a pilar dollar because you got the two pillars that appear on the back there. But this was the famous pieces of 8 coin that was minted in the millions for use in trade. Now, this piece, if you look at it, it's kind of hard to tell what size it is, but it's 93% silver. I'm not sure. That's probably, 92.5. Probably sterling is what they were thinking. But it's not an ounce. It's 0.883125 troy ounces. But again, you don't see anything on there. It's not a promise of a government, but it's just a standard weight and silver purity. And that was, even in the United States, it was considered legal tender up until 1857 in the United States. That's how, desired this coin was for its purity and standard size even though the U.S. had created its own mint by 1792. And they were using this coin up until around the time of the United States was got rid of it in 1857. They didn't get rid of it, but they just stopped allowing it to be legal tender. And also, not only did the La Casa de Moneda de Mexico in Mexico City make these coins, well, they also opened up a mint in Bolivia, right around in the city of Potosi in Bolivia, and they started making pieces of 8. So both mints were in full operation by 1600 with the massive amounts of silver that they had been producing and putting them into the pieces, making them into pieces of 8. Now today, La Casa de Moneda de Mexico still makes, they don't make a pieces of 8, but they make the Mexican Silver Libertad. So you can see there, they started, there's a 1982 version and a 1995 version. Pretty much the same. You've got the Winged Liberty there in the back. Just to show you the mint still functions. It's interesting that the Mexican mint, while it's still it's the largest silver mining country in the world, they don't really mint that many silver coins. You can buy these things, these silver libertads. They're scarce though. They make a couple of million a year at best. Some years they make under $1 million, and that is their silver bullion coin, and they really don't mint a lot of them. Certainly not in the amounts that they used to mint the pieces of 8. Okay, now that the Spanish and Portuguese have established, well, the Portuguese have established trade in India, the Spanish have established a source of riches in the New World, in their gold and silver mines. What are they going to do with their silver? Well, remember, the original reason they went to the Americas wasn't to find silver, and once they found it, they were happy they found it. It was to get the spices. Well, now they've acquired silver. The Chinese love silver, want silver. There's a silver shortage in China in the mid to late 16th century. They absolutely want silver. And the Spanish and the Portuguese absolutely want what the Chinese are selling, which is silk. We're going to go through some of the items that China was selling. This was the root of setting up a truly global trading system, silver for silk, silk for silver, and vice versa, and running an entire global trading system that would run from Manila to Acapulco, through Mexico City, back to Seville, Cadiz in Spain, and essentially, and then from Portugal back around to India, and it would run the full globe, just like Magellan had done his trip. So in 1571, the Spanish founded Manila, and it became an international city. 20,000 Philippines, 15,000 Chinese, 7,000 Spanish, and eventually there was a problem. By 1603, China had, we're not going to get into that story right now, but tens of thousands of Chinese were killed by the local population. But during this time period, in 1571 and so on, that was a focus point for the Chinese to come and trade with the Spanish, and then they would send the silver from Acapulco, Mexico, across the Atlantic, and they had to figure out a way of getting it back. And there was a guy, his name was, he's not famous, but in this book, one of the books that I read in preparation for this, called The Silver Way by Peter Gordon and Juan Jose Morales, his name was Andres de Urdaneta, and he figured out, finally, when they were in Manila, how to get from Manila east across the ocean back to Acapulco. Once they established that link, then you truly had the global system. Now, one of the interesting things also about the ship routes, these are almost, they were, not even almost, were proprietary secrets which gave the Spanish and the Portuguese a big leg up. Because you had to know the direction of the winds, you had to know how to sail. It wasn't just knowing how to sail, you had to know when the winds were in place and how to get there. And it really gave the Portuguese and the Spanish a huge head start that probably kept them in power 50 to 70 years. It wasn't until the defeat of the Spanish Armada until late 1588 that the English even started to get on the seas in a significant way. Same with the Dutch a little later. So the Spanish were 1530, Portuguese, that whole era when they're finding all this silver in the New World, so to speak, the southern part of North America, Mexico, Central America, South America, they really had no equal in that area other than the trying to compete with the locals. Now, after they set up Manila, then they had the Acapulco, Mexico City. Potosi was not really a trading city. That was just a place where they got the silver from. Then a lot of it went through Lima or went up the coast, and they traded it from Panama City. So the Spanish and the Portuguese had set all this up very well, and they then had to transport all the silver, and they transported it in these galleons here. There's an example of one of them. I'm not sure if this one is a particular Spanish ship, but these were used, and they carried the massive amounts of silver and gold back to the New World and also across the Pacific, and sometimes they lost. A lot of silver was lost in shipwrecks. And then later on, once people caught on that there were caravans of these ships going across the sea with all this wealth in it, that's when you had the pirates. But that's a little later on. In the beginning, you didn't have the piracy because they didn't know how to ride the ships the way the Spanish and the Portuguese did. Now, the Chinese also had ships. They were even bigger than these ships, like 100 years earlier in the Ming Dynasty. And they used those to set up trading routes in the around the Indian Ocean. But by the time that the Spanish were coming and the Portuguese and the trading were coming, they were essentially not using their shipping as much. They were just using the Philippines as a trading post, and they also had trading posts all along the Chinese coast. Now, what the Spanish wanted was silk, clearly. That's the Silk Road concept. And the Chinese were masters at growing the mulberry trees, the leaves, and getting the silkworm, and then making them into all types of silk articles of clothing. They had ivory, they had tapestries, velvet tablecloths. They had so many beautiful things that the Westerners want. Linens. Then, of course, they also had their own spices. They weren't as rich in spices as some of the Spice Islands or Indonesia or India, but they still had nutmeg, ginger. They had salt pork, chestnuts, porcelain. That was a big thing. You finally see that. The Dutch got into that, and then they started making their own Delft ware. And what did China want for this? Well, just like today, they want to get paid in, back today they get paid in dollars. Back then what they wanted was silver. And they had already moved away from, the Chinese invented the paper currency, but they had problems that we're not going to get into. But you can imagine when you print the currency that what can go wrong, it can go wrong. So they had recently converted their entire system into a bimetallic system. And you could pay your taxes in silver. The trade was done in silver. And the two metals that they used were not gold and silver. They were copper. And they call these copper cash coins that they used. And this round coin with the square in it, that is a typical design that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years in Chinese culture. And these are the smaller, I guess you would call them change. Today they're like good luck. And then also they had silver tael. Now these are not Tael. These are not the ones from that time period. But just to give you an idea that they did make silver coinage much, much later. But during this time period, they had the silver ingots that they called taels. Now, for those of you interested in ratios, you needed 1,000 copper cash, these round copper coins, to get one silver tael, which was 1.2 ounces. So it's pretty much the what you would imagine today. So it's like 1,000 pennies and you get an ounce or so of silver. A little less than today because that's only about $10 an ounce, or it's less because you get 1.2 ounces. But you get the idea. Copper was pretty valuable then too. They used it for brass. But there was a huge shortage in silver at the time in China. And part of the reason was they just didn't have the same mining, but also they were using it now as part of the government's plan to make you pay your taxes in silver, pay your military in silver, take care of great public works like the Great Wall of China. The people who built this, if they were paid, they were paid in silver. So there was definitely a silver shortage, but you had all these goods that the Chinese could produce with the silkworm and other crafts that they could make. And it was very fortunate or fortuitous that the seemed to be an unlimited supply of silver. It's just a matter of getting it to China from the Spanish and the Portuguese. And a couple of interesting points about silver versus gold. And the silver people will love this. There are two accounts here, one from the 1600s, 1609, and the other from a guy you wouldn't know. He's just a contemporaneous merchant that they quoted in this book, The Silver Way, called Pedro de Baeza. And then later Adam Smith talked about it as well. But here's what they're talking about. This guy, Pedro de Baeza, said there were enormous quantities of 22 karat gold in China. And that in China, the gold price rose and fell just like supply and demand, and does not have a fixed value, he said, as it does here in Castile, which is Spain. And then he talks about how a peso of gold costs 5.5 pesos of silver. And at its dearest, 7.5 pesos of silver, which means the gold-silver ratio in China was 5.5 to 1 and maybe 7.5 to 1. Later on, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations mentioned that it is more advantageous to carry silver thither than gold. So almost a carry trader, because in China, he writes, the greater part of the other markets of India, the proportion between let me get it up on the board for you so you can read this as well. He's talking about how the gold-silver ratio, here it is, the portion between fine silver and 5 gold is but as 10 or at most 12 to 1. Now it had gone up from the 5.5 to 7.5 to 1. Most because so much silver had rushed into China over the last 100 or so years before he wrote this. Whereas in Europe, it is 14 or 15 to 1. So he's saying that the ratio, it made sense. You actually made a lot better bringing the silver to China than even if you just brought it to Spain. So if you brought it to Spain, there was already so much silver, it had been devalued because the money supply had increased because there's already a lot of silver in Spain and the ratio is already higher. But in China, where there was a shortage and they already had a lower ratio, you really made a fortune bringing your silver into China and then, exchanging it for those goods. So it was a good deal for everyone because it wasn't a good deal for the people working in the mines, the indigenous Native Americans, but it was a good deal for the Chinese to get all this silver, and it was a good deal for the European traders to get all those Chinese goods. Now they estimate about 10 million ounces a year during this period of 34 years went into China. And they think that about 40% of all that mined silver, they think 1 billion ounces, were mined during this time, which is a massive amount given the mining techniques they had back then, especially in Potosi. They had to come up with a mercury mine about 4 or 5 years after they discovered the silver there made it much easier to process the silver into paste, then you would use the mercury, but of course that creates an environmental disaster. But it did help increase the production of the silver, and they say about 40% of that silver went to China, which means that the Native Americans, that's how global it is. The Native Americans in the mines in South America were working so that Chinese people could have silver. And there were things other than silver that the Europeans were delivering to China, but they weren't indigenous European goods. They were things that they got from the New World, like sweet potatoes, peanuts, corn, tobacco, chili peppers. So a lot of the foodstuffs in China, it was very easy to grow sweet potatoes, and it did help them grow their population because sweet potatoes grow in pretty much any soil. If you think of some of your famous Chinese dishes, they're made with chilies, they're made with peanuts, peanut oil, and so on. So it's very interesting that silver really was, according to this book, The Silver Way, the beginning of, or the linchpin of the new global economy. And I had done a YouTube and a blog post, I think I called The Pieces of Eight, the world's first reserve currency. So if you're interested in this, let me tell you some of the sources that I looked at to prepare for this. But one of the things I look at a lot, I have a subscription to the Great Courses Plus, and there they have thousands of college-style lectures, and 3 of them I pulled from. One is called the Ming Dynasty, Trade in Spanish Silver, and I'll give you a link below, and you can, I think it's like $9 a month or $14 a month, and you can watch whatever you want. This one was called Understanding Imperial China Dynasty's Life and Culture. Another one was 1571, Spain and Portugal Encircle the Globe. That was an economic history of the world since 1400. That's Professor Donald Herald. The Ming Dynasty one was Professor Andrew Wilson. And then there was one called the Spanish Main, which is that area we were talking about of Florida, Texas, Caribbean, Central America, South America. Trade Convoys and Piracy, lecture number 17. That was from the History of Spain, Land on a Crossroad. And that was Professor Joyce Salisbury. And finally, the book, James Henry Anderson had references to me the other day. There was a Guardian article that mentioned the book. I went out and got it. It's called The Silver Way by Peter Gordon and Juan Jose Morales. So all interesting stuff in there, only scratching the tip of the iceberg. But thanks for listening, and let's see if you guys have any comments or questions. All right. I'm going to take a look here. Got the normal gang that's here. Ann is here. Roger is here. Bob is here. MH is here. Let's see if we got any. De La Villa is here. She says, hola. La Plata Peak is here. Yeah, Scott is here. The whole crowd is here. All right, let's see if we got any questions here. De La Ville. Lewis is the sage of mugs. Roger Henley. Lewis is a merchant trader for mugs. Screw the spices. You can put spices in a small gold mug. That is a fact. Bob Arsenault. Silver to the moon. 1,000 silver. Here we come. There you go. Of course. Coins A to Z. Hello, all this guy muggers. Here we are. Roger Henley. Let's see. Gusta Broken is here. He's putting up music. Okay. Roger Henley says, so with all the silver around hundreds of years ago, you're trying to say silver's going to the moon. No, actually, it's a good time to discuss this because, as you can see, the gold-silver ratio has varied for various reasons. Now, think about why. I don't know why gold was so plentiful in China at the time and silver wasn't. But I think when China decided to use silver as the currency along with the copper, that created demand for silver. Once silver was money, period, so to speak. It's the same like when you had the demand for silver up until the mid-60s. In every major country had to have silver in order to print its coins. Now, even though we had massive amounts of silver starting in the 1600s that weren't around before. At some point, the mines start to dry up, but you still have populations growing. India had silver coinage. China had silver coinage in the 20th century. England, France, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada, Mexico, all these countries had silver coinage. So there was a demand for silver. And I think what happened when the United States was they realized that there was a growing demand for silver in industry, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it as a monetary metal. And then they realized it's kind of not necessary in coins because we can make the coins out of copper and nickel, which we have more of. So it depends on the time period which you're living in which the supply and demand for the silver exists. The other point is today the markets are pretty much global. And the point made in the book, The Silver Way, was back then there were local markets. So, for example, you had a different gold-silver ratio in China, and you couldn't get the silver there very easily. So there was different premiums placed on silver. And, of course, silver was probably, around the mine in Potosi. It was probably, it was flowing like water, so it didn't have the same value that it would have in China. And not only in China, because there's a shortage, but because of the enormous expense and risk to get that silver over to China. So when I say today that you can't use history, people think that it's something like it's fixed, period. No, it's not. It depends on what the demand profiles are at the time. And clearly, China had a need for silver. Another interesting point about China today, they go bonkers for gold. They do not go bonkers for silver as an investment metal. I've pointed this out before. According to Silver Institute, the Americans purchase more investment silver, not on a per capita basis, but on an absolute basis than Chinese. And Chinese are how many times more populous? So it's just a difference in demand profile today. The Chinese don't go nuts for silver. Indians still go nuts for gold, but they've taken a liking to silver as well. But the way the gold-silver ratio comes about isn't because historically it has always been 16-1 and it comes out of the ground at 9-1. It's not as robotic or as moronic as that. You have to look at the way things are. And just because it once was a certain way, we don't have these mega finds anymore of silver. If we did, then that would drive the price down probably. It is different. It's not like gold and silver are attached at the hip as money at a certain ratio. Currently, gold has the leg up, as we noted the other day, in that it's still part of the financial system. So there's a built-in demand there that doesn't exist for silver. And people try to insist, but silver is money. It's not in the same way that gold is, and it's clearly not in the same way it was in 16th century China, where they had to have it for coins and you had to pay your taxes in it. Now think about that in the United States. If you had to use silver only to pay all debts, and when they build airports and roads, they have to pay the contractors in silver, silver would be a lot higher today, but it's not. I saw the other day we're talking about, I think it was Jim Willey was I didn't watch it, but on X22 report, the gold trade note. Okay, well that gives some value to gold if there are countries, I don't know if they are, but if countries trade in gold, and that adds some demand for gold. If they don't do it in silver, then again, there's no reason why the gold-silver ratio should be much lower. All right, what else do we have here? History repeats most times. Probably that's true, but it's not true. The pattern repeat. The pattern of supply and demand never repeat, because it's not like every 80 years we see a major silver mine come up and that's going to drive the price of silver down. Or we always find a big gold find and therefore the price of gold goes down. So the ratio is not history repeating itself. The ratios come and go based on the dynamic, which doesn't repeat, of supply and demand. So if China wants to get rid of paper currency and use silver, that drives the demand for silver up. That doesn't mean that it should always be at that ratio, because when China gets rid of the silver standard, then obviously the value and the demand for silver goes down. And I always say this, forget the monetary component. If there's a huge demand for silver, let's say for solar or for something else, well, then there's no reason why the ratio has to stay at 85 to 1. It would come down. It wouldn't come down for monetary purposes. It could go to, no, I'm not predicting this. But if there's a mega demand on for some reason, for silver, and not because some pumpers telling you silver is rarer than gold, and it is so useful in our lives, that's not why it's going to go to 1 to 1. It might go to 1 to 1 if there was some type of government mandated program, or let's say some global initiative where everyone had to be on the Green New Deal, and everyone had in 5 years have solar panels on their house. The solar panel manufacturers wouldn't have time to even consider any other way, and they'd have to start making them with silver. Now, eventually, they'd figure out how to thrift or get rid of the silver, but there might be a crunch on silver. I'm not predicting this. I'm just saying you can't say that there's a ratio that's fixed between the two metals. It depends on what's happening in the market that impacts the supply and demand. All right. What else? Enjoy silver. PM price is just numbers. If banks are controlling some things, it's miners' margins. Miners' stocks have lost money for long-term holders over decades. Well, that's definitely true. Yeah, Pablo says, at that time, China didn't want silver for their manufacturing or vaults. Imagine that happened today. But you're pointing out exactly what John Kennedy was pointing out in the early 60s while he was trying to demonetize silver. He said silver serves no monetary use other than the purpose of making coins. It is a valuable industrial metal, he was saying. And then finally, Johnson decided it's not even worth it for coins. So and this is the point about demand for anything, if you straining the supply of silver, because as Pablo says, that China is making manufactured products with silver, it's storing silver as a store of value, and it needs it as money, then something has to give. And most people think, well, then the silver is going to skyrocket. No, what'll happen is the manufacturers will switch maybe to something different, or they'll take the silver out of the coins. They'll do something, and that's generally what happens. It's not like everyone mindlessly just consumes the same product because they've always consumed it. So, for example, I saw this foolish article once. It was trying to say that solar panel demand was going to be like 4 billion ounces a year in 15 years. And I thought, no, it's not, because they won't use solar power if they need 4 billion ounces a year. They don't have 4 billion ounces a year to throw at silver. But of course, he just extrapolated the current price. I mean, the current amount of silver that's used, if it rises X-fold, then this is how much they would need. It would never happen that way, because a solar manufacturer would either go out of business if it had to buy silver at ridiculous prices. But even well before it got to that, they would figure out ways to use less of it, use nanoparticles, use something else, or not use solar energy as the solution to creating to having sustainable energy. So I think people don't understand that. They just insist that everything in the past is rigid and everything in the going forward is rigid, and it's not. Because in the past, yes, the past has been set, it's done, but it wasn't rigid what was happening. They were just as much in tune with changing dynamics, changing supply and demand then that set those prices as we are today. Acapulco, Mexico. Yeah, Anarcho-Poco, isn't it? Augusta Broken, why did the banks take all of our silver and gold coins out of circulation? That's for another video, I guess. All right. What else do we have? Berwick, Pershanti Girl. Roger. Bix complains he hasn't got the views he believes he has, so he blames YouTube for shadow banning. I don't know about that. He gets plenty of views. Plenty of views. I can complain. I don't get any views. That's all right. I know. What's interesting is the channel is small enough I recognize everybody in the comments, which is good. Coin says the Great Wall of China can actually be seen from outer space. Yes. Not only can it be seen from outer space, it can be seen from Smaulgld. Look. Can you see it? Can you see it from Smaulgld? There is the Great Wall of China. You know what I didn't put up yet? My nightly pitch. My nightly pitch. Where is it? I haven't mentioned mugs. Yeah, we did mention mugs. No mention of mugs tonight. I'll just leave you with this here. All right. If you're looking at your screen. What else do we have? This guy, all as one, received this t-shirt today, and I'm happy with the quality and design. Very well made. So you got a this guy t-shirt. All right. Very nice. Yeah, Prasanti girl, you're making a good point that Rothbard once made. And this is something that you all should think about. I joined Rothbard once. I forgot what it was about. And he was saying that he was misguided when he was younger, that he was meeting all these libertarians and he figured they're all good guys because they're libertarians. And he said that's not the case. Just because someone like agrees with you doesn't mean you can trust them and that they're going to share your other values. And he said it's a mistake to think that you just go into business with people because they're all libertarians. He said he found that out very, very early. It might not even be your best friends. All right. You would like to think it's true, though, but maybe not. Okay, chili peppers are good, she says. All right. ASMR people is here. He says, hello, game changers. All right. I think we're done here. We got a lot of comments, but... Pablo. Lewis, I was referring to silver demand to China for no particular reason, just wanting with a sense of value. As today, Russia's demand for gold, they stack 1 million ounces for February, and it's not money. No. Let's do Russia first. Russia does stack 1 million ounces because they can include it on their balance sheet as an asset. Russia could stack silver, oil, platinum, palladium for other reasons. They could store it because they're strategic metals. But actually, Russia stores gold because it's money, because it can be put on their balance sheet. It has nothing to do with Basel III. Central banks have always put the value of their gold mark to market on their balance sheet. Basel III is talking about commercial banks and what they can include on their balance sheet. Different thing. Now, China, for no particular reason, just wanting with a sense of value. Yeah, okay. I did not misunderstand that. You got to have mug in the game, he says. All right. Prashanti girl is laughing at something I said, and I don't know what it is, but it already happened, so let's see. All right. Last comment here. Coins AZ. The U.S. has produced non-circulating coins and metals in glass and wood, but there's actually at least one country that has circulating coins printed on plastic vellum. Yeah, they have, I think Canada now has some plastic bills, or England is introducing them. All right. I think that's it. I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight. If you're interested in other silver history, there's a link here. I'll leave it for you right now. You can go over there and check it out. It has, I'll read you the topics and maybe get you interested in checking out some of the other Smaulgld silver history YouTubes. Let me just get them up here for you in the playlist. I'll give you the link. All right, so the history of silver, you go to playlist, history of silver. Here is the link. And the first title is When the U.S. Confiscated Silver. So that's a very, very interesting, there you go, there's your thing there. When the U.S. Confiscated Silver. And then we have another one called The Decline and Fall of the World's First Silver Empire. That one is about the Roman Empire. Then we have President Johnson's 1965 warning on silver. Very interesting information there. Then we have one called The Real Silver Shortage, and it's not about the pumpers today. It's about an actual U.S. silver shortage. Very interesting. Then there's one called The World's First Reserve Currency, Pieces of 8. Then we have one called The Last Silver Empire. That deals with the United States. Then recently we did a Silver Cross, Too Heavy to Bear. That was the Democrats' farewell to silver. That was Johnson and Kennedy. And then we also have the Cross of Gold, the famous William Jennings Bryant pitch for free silver. Gold versus silver, rich versus poor. So if you're interested in the history of silver, you got a list there. You can spend a couple of hours and learn a bit more about the history of silver. All right. Pablo Pino, are you Calabrian background? No. It's close, but that's not my neck of the woods. I'm a little further north than that. My area would be considered, it's not Neapolitan, it's south of that. It's in between Naples and Calabria. All right. Good night, everyone.